Well, today, of course, is Easter. This is the particular day in the year, in the calendar of the church when we pay special attention to the story of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, this story of resurrection, of course, is not something which we just call to mind once a year. It is the reason, after all, that Christians worship on Sunday. Every Sunday, in a sense, is Easter. The story of the resurrection is one which has captivated humankind for the last 2,000 years or so. The story has received an unparalleled amount of attention and thought and learned reflection. You would be stunned to see how many books have been written about this little episode, which happened on a deserted morning just outside of Jerusalem. The books would stretch all the way around this room and might fill up its center. One of my favorite books, in fact, is a scholarly volume which goes into some 800 pages worth of detailed and learned reflection on the story of the resurrection of Jesus. What is it about this story which is so captivating? What material is there that is food for such tremendous thought and reflection? One thing that many have found interesting is the amazing circumstantial evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Circumstantial evidence such as the preservation of the account that it was women who were the first witnesses and the first to report the story. In that day and age, the testimony of a woman was discounted. It was to be mocked and scorned. Yet how remarkable and how wonderful it is that the earliest Christians preserved this testimony of the women, something which surely they would not make up in that particular way. Circumstantial evidence such as the remarkable transformation of the followers of Jesus. You may recall that in the wake of his arrest and trial and crucifixion, that the disciples scattered. They ran away and hid in fear of their own lives. Peter, the leader perhaps amongst the disciples, claimed not even to know who Jesus was and to never have met him. In the aftermath of Easter, we find these same frightened followers proclaiming with boldness the story of the resurrection, not only in Jerusalem but around the Mediterranean world. We find circumstantial evidence such as the absolute explosion of the Christian faith. Christianity expanded at a numerical and a geographic rate which was unparalleled in antiquity. What is it that caused such growth? Subsequent generations of Christians may not have been there to witness Easter. They may not have encountered the risen Jesus. But something has happened which has caused these great ripple effects to go out from this center in subsequent years and in subsequent centuries down to the very present day. Those who have thought most carefully about the story of Easter have often been very interested in the different details which are preserved in the four New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A few minutes ago, Dick touched on some of those differences, and people have wondered, what do those differences mean? How can they help us or not determine what might have happened that very first Easter? With all of that said, if we look one at a time at the gospel accounts, if we look at the way just one of the writers has told the story of Easter, we are likely to be struck by how brief and cursory it seems. The different gospel writers present the events of that first Easter morning as like little images, flashes of memory. Think about how you remember significant moments in your past and how today they remain just momentary images, flashes, glimpses. This is how the gospel accounts present themselves. They are not full of detailed reflection. They are not full of questions, why or how. That reflection has been left to subsequent generations, and in some ways it is left to us. But to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and to those first followers, those first witnesses whose words and memories they contain, they are but quick glimpses. If they were to appear in the news today, they would perhaps be like a few moments of grainy cell phone video. And we might be wondering, what happened? Something did, but we're not sure exactly what or how or why. Our reading today came from the Gospel of Matthew and Matthew's version of the Easter story. Matthew tells us that Mary Magdalene and another follower of Jesus named Mary went to the tomb at first light on the first day of the week, as soon as the Sabbath day of rest had ended at dawn. And when they got to the tomb, an angel came suddenly and strikingly from heaven. There was an earthquake, the ground shook. The angel appeared as light, and the angel's clothes were white as pure snow. The angel rolled away the stone from the mouth of the tomb and sat on it. There were guards at that tomb, soldiers, guarding, protecting the body of Jesus. The gospel writer tells us that they passed out. The women were fearful, but managed to retain consciousness. And the angel said to them, "You seek Jesus, the crucified one. He is not here, he is risen. Do not be afraid." I find it so amazing that those women on that first Easter morning and subsequent disciples who encountered the risen Lord were overcome with fear. We have gathered perhaps with joy, with anticipation. We have looked forward to this time. We've put on our Sunday best. Those women were understandably fearful. It's interesting that throughout the story of the Bible, we find whenever there is a human encounter with heaven, whenever heaven is opened up and an angel has come with a message and a word from God, people are fearful. They are overcome with the surprise. They are struck dumb with awe. And whenever that message has come from heaven, whenever the messenger is from God, the first words spoken are, "Do not be afraid." God knows how these experiences seem to us, and God offers words of reassurance, but nonetheless they are experiences which strike us with fear. Many of you, if not all of you, will recall those frightening stories from last spring and summer that came from northern Alberta and the wildfire which encroached upon and eventually enveloped much of the city of Fort McMurray. It was a shocking story, something that no one would ever have expected. We have never seen anything like that, a wild forest fire come upon an inhabited, a built-up, a civilized area. And what is particularly amazing is how little warning the people of that community had. Oh, there had been a fire burning outside of town for some days, but no one ever imagined what was to come. And then there was an evacuation warning given for one corner of the city. And less than 2 hours later, an evacuation order was given for the entire city. Everyone, leave now. And there was no time to reflect, only time to act. And it didn't matter quite how afraid one would be, or what was running through one's mind. One would maybe have a few moments to grab some photo albums or a family pet and get out of danger. Amazingly, no lives were taken. Thanks be to God. Sometimes we think of the story of Easter as something to think about, but to ponder, to reflect on over a period of days, months, years, even a lifetime. Something to chat about over coffee, to have an intellectual conversation. When it comes to the story of Easter, we often think that our job as God's people is like that of the Canadian Senate, to be a sober second thought. When we do that, we become about as effective as followers of Jesus as the Canadian Senate is at legislation. We ought to think about the story of Easter more like a wildfire, striking us with awe and even terror. It is no coincidence, perhaps, that in a few short weeks we find the disciples of Jesus experiencing the story of Pentecost and the outpouring of God's Spirit upon them in what seemed to be tongues of fire over each of them. Tongues of fire which enabled their boldness and proclamation. "Go and tell the others," said the angel. "He goes ahead of you to Galilee, and you will see him there." And the women ran away, the narrator tells us, with fear and with great joy. I am always fascinated in these accounts by the mixtures of fear and joy. The fear has not gone away, but it has made room for joy. The joy has come, but it is uncertain and incomplete, and it leaves room for fear to remain. They experienced both feelings at the same time, fear and joy. One of those moments or days I will never forget is the day that my daughter Emily was born. My wife's water broke at 9 o'clock or so one cold February evening. And right away, her contractions started very quickly, 5 minutes apart. Now, we lived 38 kilometers from the hospital. We lived in a small rural village, and there was countryside between our community and the community where the hospital was located. I know it was 38 kilometers because I was a minister, and I drove to the hospital once a week or so, and I claimed the mileage. So 76 kilometers round trip. Well, it was a snowy and a blustery night. And we piled out into the car, and we drove off down the road, and as soon as we got out into the countryside, the weather was absolutely terrible. There was so much snow on the road that you couldn't even really see where the road was. You certainly couldn't see any lines on the road, and the plows had not yet come out. And the snow continued to fall, and it continued to blow, and there was no visibility. And my wife's contractions were coming faster and faster and faster. Let me tell you, it was fear. Well, by the grace of God, we made it to the hospital in time, and half an hour later, our daughter was born. Great joy. Fear, the fear was not gone, but there was now room for joy. And I'll never remember a couple of days later when it was time to go home from the hospital, and we put this wonderful little baby, this tiny little thing, into the carrier. And we were so excited, so joyful to be going home, and then you get home and you realize, oh, I guess we're responsible now. And there's fear. The good news of the story of that first Easter, of the risen Jesus, ought to strike us, if we're hearing it right, with both fear and joy. Well, those two women were running away from the tomb. And lo and behold, they encountered the risen Lord. And they went straight down on their faces, and they grabbed him by the ankles, and they worshiped him. Something so wonderful about their physical posture. They were laid out. They didn't think about it. They could only react, and they reacted in the only way possible. It's interesting in the Bible and in the original languages of the Bible how the etymology for the words for worship are related to physical posture. To worship in the Greek of the New Testament is to bend at the knee. When the scriptures tell us in various places that God's people are being unfaithful, God's people are called stiff-necked. What does it mean to be stiff-necked except to not be bowing before Almighty God? To be stiff-necked is to be upright. To not be worshiping as we are called to do. To not be humbling ourselves in the presence of God. One of my greatest mentors in faith spends an hour or an hour and a half at the beginning of every single day on his face. And he finds that when he is lying down on his front with his face to the ground, he is most ready and able to encounter God and to hear a word from God that will inspire and energize his day. If truly we came before God, we would all be on our faces. We would not be ready for the wonder of it all. To have even the slightest glimpse of the Almighty, it's something we cannot even imagine. We might say that we want it. We might think that we want it, but are we ready for it? I have to confess that I'm a bit of a movie buff. I don't watch as many as I used to, but I'm not a movie buff in a way that would impress anyone. I don't watch intellectual movies. I don't watch clever movies. I don't watch movies with foreign subtitles on the bottom. I watch Hollywood blockbuster movies, action movies, cheap thrills. I don't even mind a bit of cheese now and then. Well, one of the cheesy movies that I kind of like is Rudy. Some of you have seen Rudy. It's about a young boy who grew up in Joliet, Illinois, and he was a football player. He was a good football player, but not a great football player. Now, he grew up like his father and his brothers and probably his grandfather before them as a fan of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish football team. And it was his dream to go and to put on those golden helmets and to run out on the field with his heroes. Now, he didn't have the grades to get into that university. It's a very prestigious university. His family certainly didn't have the money to send him, and frankly, he was not good enough to compete at that level. But the movie tells a story. It's an inspiring story. In large part, it is true. About how Rudy fought hard for his dream. And he worked on his grades, and he got help, and he was eventually admitted into the University of Notre Dame. And he'd kept working on his football, his fitness, his strength. And he joined the football team as a practice squad player. And then eventually he got onto the team. Now, he was not good enough to dress. Only a certain number of players can dress for each game. He was part of the fringe of players that would come to practice but never get to dress for the game. Well, he worked so hard and got reasonably good. But it wasn't even because of how good he was, but because of his incredible work ethic and how inspiring he'd been to his teammates that he was allowed to dress for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish for the last game of his senior year. He could put on the jersey and the golden helmet and run out onto the field. Now, his family all this time had been, skeptical of this dreamer. But over time, they became impressed and inspired, and for the last game of the season, when he got to suit up and run out onto the field, his family came to the game. And then my favorite part of the movie is when his dad comes out into the stadium, into the seating area, and he looks out over the field and over the stands, and he probably hears the brass band practicing. And he sees a scene which, to that point in his life, he'd only been able to imagine. He sees a scene which, for the first 60 years of his life, he had probably heard described only on radio or seen only on grainy black and white television. And he looked out on this wonderful scene and he said, "This is the most beautiful sight my eyes have ever seen. Imagine how it would be if we encountered the risen Lord, the grace and the power of the love of God in human flesh. It would be the most wonderful sight our eyes have ever seen. No matter who we are or where we come from or how much money we have or what we think of ourselves, we would be on our faces with our hands around his ankles, worshiping him." All of that said, the Gospel of Matthew tells this story in a brief and almost incomplete way. what you've heard is all there is. That's what the first witnesses saw. That's what they reported. That's it. And that's all. But it is enough to change your life and mine and to transform our world. Thanks and praise be to God. Amen.